Okay, so the Egypt and Mesopotamia review session. So on the review stuff that you have, the packet that goes along with this presentation, you've got these true-false statements at the beginning. You also have a map. So these true-false statements, most early religions were polytheistic. Well, we have polytheistic beliefs develop in Mesopotamia. We have polytheistic beliefs develop in Egypt. We have polytheistic beliefs early on develop in India until they're replaced by Hinduism and Buddhism. And then we have polytheistic beliefs develop in China. So I'm going to go with true. Mesopotamia means land between the rivers. This is true. That is literally what Mesopotamia means. The third statement, early civilizations developed in river valleys. So, yeah, these are called river valley civilizations. True. The first written law code came from Mesopotamia. That is also true. We're going to talk about Hammurabi's code, and also the Ten Commandments are a law code that develops in this region. Polytheism means the belief in one God. Well, poly means many, and mono means one, so no. Polytheism does not. Monotheism does. Mesopotamia is geographically isolated. No, it's very much at a crossroads, and early Egyptians mastered dentistry. That's actually true. I learned that at the dentist once, so that's why it's here. All right, so we're going to be looking at the river valley civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. This is the stuff that you're supposed to know according to the state of Virginia. But if you notice, it says that you're supposed to be able to describe the origins, beliefs, traditions, and customs and spread of Judaism, which you should be able to do, but that's not something that we're going to cover in this review session. There's going to be a separate one on religions. All right, so our river valley civilizations, because their civilizations need to have these 5 features, right? So as we go through this, you should be able to identify that both Mesopotamia and Egypt are home to advanced cities, that they're both home to specialized workers, complex institutions, record keeping, advanced technology. We have both Mesopotamia and Egypt as river valley civilizations. They're also the home of some of the earliest civilizations around the world. In particular, the Fertile Crescent, which includes Mesopotamia. This is seen as the cradle of civilization. So there it is, the Fertile Crescent. And as you can see on the map, Mesopotamia is written in between the rivers. That's because that's all that is Mesopotamia, whereas all the stuff that's green is the Fertile Crescent. Now you can see that there's some stuff over by Egypt, right, where we've got this colored in too. This is still fertile, but this isn't really considered part of the Fertile Crescent. This stuff is the Fertile Crescent. It's kind of crescent shaped. So the 2 rivers that we're dealing with in the Fertile Crescent are the Tigris and the Euphrates. So the Tigris is the one that is the easternmost of the 2. The Euphrates is the one in the west. You can remember that because it would be awfully convenient if Euphrates was in the east because it starts with an E, but it doesn't. It's not. So it's flipped. I don't know if that helps you, but it helps me. This region is technically Asia. This is Southwest Asia. And so, as you know, river valleys are ideal places to start civilizations because they're fertile, right? So we can have agriculture. The problem with Mesopotamia, so the benefit is that, we can farm really easily. It's fertile. The problem is that it's also easily accessible, right? So that's nice for arriving. It's easy for me as an early human in the Paleolithic to migrate into Mesopotamia, and it's easy for me to make a transition into the Neolithic in Mesopotamia because I don't have a lot of natural barriers that I have to cross to get to this place. But that means that people that want to invade also don't have a lot of barriers that they have to cross to get to this place, right? So that means that it's going to be changing hands over and over and over again throughout history. These rivers also flood regularly. Frequently. I don't know that it's really regularly. That's part of the problem. If they were flooding regularly, it'd be easy, right? Because you could predict it, but they flood on an irregular basis. It's unexpected. Sometimes they might flood, sometimes they don't flood at all. We do need some flooding. Otherwise, we have to be able to develop complex irrigation techniques, and we're not doing that early on. So this is going to impact the worldview of Mesopotamians because we're going to see the river as this thing that is an agent of a capricious God who has little regard for us as humans. And so God help you when you get to the afterlife, because if this is how we're being treated in our daily lives in reality, then when we die and we are in the realm of the gods, we're going to be in a position where it's going to be like eternal hellfire and damnation because they clearly don't like us and they need to be appeased, and they punish us with these horrible flooding rivers. But they're not like, it's not just like terrible floods all the time, because why would you settle there in the first place, right? So it has to be manageable. All right, so the people that settle in Mesopotamia, the first civilization that develops there is Sumer, or Sumeria, as it's sometimes called. So this is in the Fertile Crescent, and this is at the mouth of the river, the base of the river, where it flows out into the Persian Gulf. So that's sort of the heart, right? And that means that we're actually going to have a lot of contact over time with other civilizations because it's well positioned for trade by sea. So the cities that we have developed in Sumer are the cities of Ur and Uruk and Lagash and Babylon. So a couple of these, Ur and Babylon, are probably the two most significant of these cities. We have lots of different groups living in Mesopotamia and in the Fertile Crescent. It's not one consistent culture throughout the whole region. So we've got Sumerians, we've got the Hebrews, we have the Phoenicians, we have the Assyrians, we have the Babylonians, we have Babylonians Part 2, the Chaldeans. We have all these different groups, the Hittites eventually, all these different groups in this area because we don't have these natural barriers to prevent other groups from coming in. The Phoenicians are significant because they are known as carriers of civilization. They are excellent sailors. The Phoenicians didn't ever establish an empire. They're sort of like the weird black sheep of the Fertile Crescent because they're not out to build an empire. It's like their whole thing is just economic motivation, not like military conquest or political domination. They do establish trading centers around the Mediterranean in the cities of Tyre and Sidon, for example. They develop an alphabet that becomes the basis for the Greek alphabet. They develop this purple dye that's made out of crushed up snails called murex, and this purple dye was incredibly valued in the region. So they're really like major players in the region, but at the same time they don't really seem to have any interest in building some empire, right? Like we normally have your Alexander the Greats and your Genghis Khans who are setting out to like have land as a symbol of their significance. The Phoenicians are significant, but they often get overlooked, and their role gets overlooked because they're not, they don't have this traditional goal of let me build an empire that spans the entire Mediterranean world. So they're a big deal, but they are often underrepresented when we're talking about the Fertile Crescent. In Mesopotamia, we have the development of centralized governments. Early governments tend to be based on religious authority, so that our priests are going to be our leaders early on, and eventually military leaders are going to take precedence over these religious leaders. But it makes sense that like your leader would be the person who's the most in touch with the will of the gods, right? So that's where that comes from. We have dynastic rule emerge during Mesopotamia, and we do have slavery. It's quite common in Mesopotamia, though again, slavery in the ancient world isn't exactly like slavery. I'm not advocating for slavery, but slavery in the ancient world is very different from our sort of like United States frame of reference for slavery. In Mesopotamia, we have the first political units develop. We have the first empire in the world also develop. So religion, again, key to our government. We know a lot about Sumerian religion, Mesopotamian religion, because we have these ziggurats left over. So they're sort of like step pyramids in a way, but they're not pyramids in the Egyptian sense. They're pyramids in that they are sort of triangle shaped. They're temples. Whereas a pyramid is a tomb, these are temples for worship. But people wouldn't be allowed up into the ziggurat. This would be the center of the priesthood. This would be the center of the priest's authority. So we're having this like reinforcement of the importance of religion by building these massive structures. Like, just in case you didn't notice, I'm important. You can tell because I have a ziggurat that I can retreat up into and talk to the gods. So most of our belief systems that develop in Mesopotamia are polytheistic, right? And that's true of many civilizations around the world. But we also have monotheism come into being in this region, in the Fertile Crescent region, before it develops anywhere else. And it's developed by the Hebrews. So again, other review session on religions, you should check it out. All right, so Sumer, and Sumeria if you prefer, declines, and around 2350 we have the region conquered by a rival city-state, Akkad. And so Akkad conquers Sumer, and then we have an Akkadian empire, right? Because somebody conquered somebody else, and it becomes one big new political unit. They themselves are conquered about 350 years later by a group called the Amorites, and this becomes the Babylonian kingdom. And it's from this Babylonian kingdom that we have Hammurabi and his code of laws. So what Hammurabi does is establish a law code that is going to standardize and provide for rule of law throughout his kingdom. It's not necessarily fair, like based on classes. It reflects, it's consistent more than it's fair. It doesn't treat people equally, certainly. Men and women are treated differently. Slaves and the wealthy are treated differently. But the idea is that it's consistent, and that matters. You can have bias in law as long as it's consistent. I'm not, again, advocating for biased laws, but they exist. What matters is that you're being consistent in your implementation, and that's what having it written down does for you. You have this point of reference. From the Code of Hammurabi, we get this eye for an eye concept. This is basically everything is punishable by death. You can, the eye for an eye thing is, you know, if I stab out your eye, you can stab out my eye, unless I'm a slave, and then you can just pay my owner for the loss of my eye. Or if you are rich and I stabbed out your eye, then there can be worse consequences for me. So it reflects the classes, the social classes of the time, but the idea is, again, that it's consistently applied throughout the territory. So the developments that we have in Mesopotamia are these written law codes of the Code of Hammurabi and also the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are handed down according to tradition by God, right, to Moses in the Exodus from Egypt. And this is an early law code. We also have the development of written language. The written language that develops in Mesopotamia is cuneiform. So you can see a picture of it there in the corner. There are these little wedge marks that are made with a little stylus into soft clay, and then the clay hardens. We also have the development of the Phoenician alphabet. So development of writing is essential for economic growth, right? We need to be able to keep track of taxation. We need to be able to keep track of trade, of all kinds of things that go along with economic growth. We also have the development of the wheel, which is nice. We don't have that in Egypt when we're building the pyramids, though it probably wouldn't be terribly helpful on sand. We have the development of sails and arches and ramps and columns and a numbering system. So all in all, a fairly advanced and, well-established civilization. So in Egypt, their neighbor, we have what Mesopotamia lacked, which is natural barriers. So while Mesopotamia is easily invaded, which leads to it constantly changing hands between different empires throughout its history, until practically the modern day, Egypt is well insulated. That can be good and bad for development. It means that they can develop sort of without having to worry about constant invasion, but it also means that we don't have a lot of cultural diffusion. So it's interesting because it's sort of what civilization would look like if we didn't really have a lot of outside influence for the first part. Kind of like China in a way. Like we're developing a little bit in isolation until we actively go out and start to trade with people. So Egypt was referred to by Herodotus, the Greek history, as wholly the gift of the Nile. And what he means is, if it weren't for the Nile, Egypt wouldn't exist, because if it weren't for the Nile, it would all be desert. The Nile provides some degree of protection in addition to these deserts that ring the civilization. In the north of the Nile, we've got our Nile Delta, the shallow, marshy area. So the Mediterranean isn't really a natural barrier so much. Because if anything, that makes it easier, right? I could just get in a boat and sail to your civilization and invade you, but I'm not going to be able to get my boat through the Nile Delta. So it's going to be a natural barrier. We've got these cataracts to the south. These are just sort of like rocky rapids in the river that prevent people from sailing from the south up north. Remember that also that the Nile flows north, so that would be the natural, like if someone was going to invade, they would invade from the south probably. And that does happen. Eventually Egypt gets conquered by its southern neighbors, the Nubians. So unlike the rivers in Mesopotamia that flood irregularly, the Nile floods really regularly, which allows for very predictable harvests, and it allows for crop surpluses. So unlike this really negative view that we have of the afterlife and this like quaking in our boots fear of the gods that we have in Mesopotamia, we have a much more benevolent sense of gods. Like we sort of feel like they are there to help humanity, that we can appeal to them, and that their role is to support the growth of humanity. As Egypt expands, as Egypt gets more established and grows, we do start to have the Red Sea and the Mediterranean being utilized for trade to the north, and then also for invasion of Egypt. And also there's trade along the Nile, in particular with Nubia to the south. Nubia was a region that was rich in resources that Egypt really wanted. So gold and iron and also slaves and ivory and all kinds of things that Egypt wanted as luxury goods. So they're going to become an essential trade partner. So Egyptian religion is polytheistic, again, like most of our early river valley civilizations. The primary gods in this pantheon of Egyptian gods are Ra or Re, the sun god, who takes many different forms, like Aten, which is like a globe with all these creepy hands sticking out of it. Osiris, the god of the dead. Isis, his wife and sister, the goddess of fertility, and a whole bunch of other ones. We also believe in an afterlife, and it's a much more positive view. It's sort of like whatever your lot was in life, like that's going to be your lot in death. So you're packing for death as though it's just a continuation of your life on earth. So that's why we have these tombs filled with necessary items, and that's why we practice mummification, because we're sort of thinking that like we're going to need this, like it's life part 2. So there is our sun god, there is our god of the dead, Osiris, and there is his wife and sister, Isis. So mummifying people, it's super gross, and they're probably not going to ask you about it on the SOL, but it is interesting. So you can see in the image the canopic jars below the table, and Anubis, the god of the dead, or the god of the underworld. He's like bringing people to the underworld, helps with this transition. The reason he's got the head of a jackal is because they were often in cemeteries, right, digging up bodies and eating them because they eat carrion. So that's why he's depicted that way. So there's like explanations in Egypt's life, that in its society, that explain why the gods look the way they look. All right, so we have a really rigid social structure in Egypt. We have our pharaoh at the top. Pharaoh is seen not just as a king, but as a god, as like a living god. So he's not going to be a guy that you contradict. But he's not really involved in the day-to-day management of his empire, of his kingdom. It's not really an empire yet. Our kingdom, that role falls to the vizier, who is kind of like a prime minister. So if you think about like England, we've got Queen Elizabeth, and then we've got a prime minister. We've had a rotating cast of prime ministers over the past 10 years in England. And they're the ones that are actually responsible for like the day-to-day functioning of the country. We have a lot of slave labor. We also use farmers for labor in seasons that aren't harvest seasons or planting seasons. They're not really doing anything when it's not harvest time or planting time, so we might as well make them build pyramids and stuff like that. Egypt's history is broken up into 3 different kingdoms, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. So the Old Kingdom begins in 2660 when Upper and Lower Egypt has been unified by a guy named Narmer. He's also known as the Scorpion King or as Menes. So that unification initially begins in 3100 BCE. It had been sort of two separate kingdoms, the Upper and Lower Nile. The Old Kingdom is when we have the construction of the pyramids. So this is when we've got these massive tomb structures built for our pharaohs going into the afterlife. This is when we've got the Great Pyramid, for example, the most iconic of the pyramids constructed around 2556. So near the beginning of this kingdom, we get on that pyramid building right away. It's really important. Make sure we get that done. The pyramids were not constructed by the Hebrews, just as a clarification. If you watch the crash course video, it does say that that the pyramids were constructed later than the arrival of the Hebrews. The pyramids were constructed significantly earlier than the arrival of the Hebrews. So Judaism comes into existence around 1800 BCE. So it doesn't even exist, let alone exist in Egypt when the pyramids are being built. The Old Kingdom ends because we've got internal political fighting, and then our upper and lower kingdoms sort of separate again, and we have a period of 150 years where we're not unified. So then we've got our Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is like the middle child. It's the one that's always overlooked. But, it's fine. Don't worry about it. It's okay. So the Middle Kingdom is when we have a lot of these public works projects constructed, things that are kind of a huge deal, which is weird that we don't spend more time talking about the Middle Kingdom, because a canal going from the Nile to the Red Sea, it's kind of a big deal, right? That means that we can trade with so many more people. This is when Egypt conquers Nubia to the south, so we have territorial expansion, we've got public works projects, we have the construction of temples like the temple at Karnak. So this is prosperous period during Egypt's history. But it doesn't last, forever. It lasts from 2040 to 1640. And it ends when the Hyksos, a group from the region that is modern Palestine, invades and conquers the territory. So they bring with them things like chariots, which are helpful, better weaponry. We have a lot of intermarrying between the Hyksos and the Egyptians. So they come in as conquerors, certainly, but they marry in and mix in and assimilate into Egyptian society. This is when the Hebrews arrive in Egypt. So the Middle Kingdom is followed by the New Kingdom, which lasts from 1570 to 1075. This is when Egypt is at its height economically, and we have a lot of sort of crazy rulers during the New Kingdom. This is when we have Hatshepsut, who seized the throne after the death of her husband and was supposed to just sort of be keeping it warm. She was supposed to be like a dowager, keeping the throne for her son, Thutmose III. But instead decided to remain in power for 20 years, embarked on all these trade expeditions, and built all these temples. We only somewhat recently in the grand scheme have been learning things about Hatshepsut because her son, Thutmose III, when she died, went around and had people systematically remove references to her from everything. So they clearly didn't have a great relationship. Thutmose III really focused on conquest. During this period, we've got a lot of territorial expansion. We've also got some unusual folks. We've got guys like Akhenaten, who encouraged Egyptians to stop worshiping all these different gods and instead worship one god, Aten, one of the forms of the sun god Ra. And so he took a new name. He created the name Akhenaten to incorporate that god's name, converted Egypt to monotheism, and a lot of people weren't really pleased with this. And so after his death, when his son Tutankhamun, who was originally named Tutankhaten, came to power, the only thing that Tutankhamun accomplishes in his reign is undoing the stuff that his dad had done. The only reason we care about King Tut is because his tomb, when it was discovered in the Valley of the Kings by Howard Carter, it hadn't been plundered because it was sort of tucked behind another tomb that had been plundered. Grave robbing was a big problem in Egypt, even at the time, and certainly throughout Egypt's history. So that's why King Tut's a big deal, is because he really provides a window into what life was like for the incredibly wealthy in Egyptian society. Not because he really does anything significant. He dies in his late teens, so he doesn't really have a lot of time for doing anything significant. We also have guys like Ramses II during the New Kingdom. Ramses is a big deal because he negotiates one of the first peace treaties in history with the Hittites. But the thing that you probably remember about Ramses is that he had like 100 kids. That's not really an accomplishment, but it's a thing that he does. So the thing I'd prefer that you remember is that he negotiated this peace treaty. So because of political instability eventually and the normal cast of characters with the collapse of an empire, eventually the New Kingdom comes apart and Egypt is conquered by their neighbors to the south, the Nubians. So the people living in Nubia are the Kush. So Nubia is the place, Kush are the people. So the Kushites are living to the south. You can see on the map where they're located relative to Egypt. So, here's Egypt, and this is modern Egypt, these lighter lines. This is modern Sudan, this larger blob, immediately to the south of Egypt. And Kush was located, Nubia was located in what is modern-day Sudan. Like I mentioned, Kush society was sort of rich in a lot of these luxury items that the Egyptians really wanted. Nubia had a lot of natural resources like gold and iron and ivory. And it's not just like having iron in the ground, like that's great, I guess, but being able to make weapons out of it is probably better. And so that's something that really develops as a skill during this period in Nubia, and the city of Meroe in particular becomes a center for iron working. When the Nubians conquer Egypt, it's not to rule them as a foreign power. There's so much contact throughout the history of both of these places with each other that when the Nubians rule, they're really ruling exactly like Egyptian pharaohs. They adopt Egyptian customs, they take Egyptian naming traditions, they rule as pharaohs. They do everything exactly the same. It's just that Egypt is being ruled by a foreign power. And that's going to be the case for a lot of Egypt's history. So the Egyptian written language is the hieroglyphic alphabet. For a lot of our history, we have not been able to decipher the hieroglyphic alphabet. In the hieroglyphic alphabet, you've got all of these symbols that stand for sounds, for ideas. Was originally what it was thought, and then we discovered that they really stand for sounds. In 1799, the stone, this Rosetta Stone, which isn't anything in particular. At the time, it's not like when the Rosetta Stone was created, it was like, oh, future generations might want to have like an answer key to our language, so let's make this really helpful document. The Rosetta Stone was just a royal proclamation. It talks about like all of the achievements of Ptolemy the, I think, 5th. This like 7-year-old pharaoh, all of the amazing things he had accomplished in his long reign. And it was written in hieroglyphics at the top. It was written in Demotic, which was a simpler version of hieroglyphics. And then it was written in Greek. So it was the same message in 3 languages. It would be written in Greek because Egypt gets conquered a lot, and Greek becomes sort of the language of the land for a while. So it's written in these 3 languages, and so when it's found by Napoleon's troops in 1799, it takes people a while, but then they realize, like, oh, we speak Greek, so I guess we could probably figure this out. And Jean-François Champollion is the one that is able to identify, it starts with names. So he identifies names in the hieroglyphics that match names in the Greek, and is able to, from there, decipher this whole thing. So it's not like the Rosetta Stone was created with the intention of it being this big groundbreaking thing. It just happened to be this groundbreaking thing. It's not anything special in its time. It's only significant because of what we've been able to do with it. Part of the reason we took such a long time to decipher hieroglyphics is because a lot of hieroglyphic writing was done on papyrus, which is made out of plant. The papyrus plant, these reeds are stripped and woven together and then smashed flat and dried, and it's used as paper. But it, breaks down over time, and so we don't have a lot of that left over. So it wasn't until we had this document with these 3 different languages that we were able to make that leap. In Egyptian society, we have the development of all kinds of medical advancements, setting broken bones, doing surgery, doing dentistry. We have a lot of agriculturally based technological advancements, like the one you can see in the picture. It's called a shadoof. So basically there's a weight on one side. You can see that white ball thing, and there's a pivot point, and then there's a bucket on a string, on a rope. And so you're able to use that counterweight to fill it up from the water and take this water and use it as a irrigation method. We have the construction of canals. Obviously, we have advancements in art and architecture in Egypt. We have a calendar, a fairly accurate calendar based on the movement of stars, which is going to be helpful for agriculture. We have a number system developed, and also obviously complex geometry, because we're building pyramids. So that's sort of the deal with ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. There's questions that you can find in the review quizzes. There's all kinds of stuff available to you on Blackboard, so hopefully you take advantage of all of that. All right.